"Mom, you don't need this much money, do you? We're making good use of it, after all." "That's right. Besides, Pierre would want us to live a comfortable life." Hearing their blatant words, I could barely suppress a sigh. How could they speak so casually about using the inheritance of my late husband, Pierre, as if it were their own? I recalled Pierre's bitter expression as he once spoke about this possibility. The fact that his prediction had come true pierced my heart. Surely, he wouldn't have wanted to think about such a thing. With a deep breath, I looked up and glared at my eldest son and his wife, opening my mouth to speak. "My name is Janet Bodner, just an ordinary housewife in her 50s. Currently, I manage the company my late husband once presided over, while living with my eldest son and his wife. This cohabitation, however, has its own particular reason, which I'll explain later. I have always been passionate about work, and it was in my late 20s that I met my future husband, Pierre. He was older than me and was assigned as my mentor at work. At first, I saw him as quiet and reserved, but as we worked together, I became drawn to his dedication and his dream of starting his own company. Over time, we started talking more, and I learned about his strong desire to establish a business. "Pierre, what kind of company do you want to create?" "I love seeing people happy, so I want to create products or ideas that bring joy to people and make them smile when they use them." "Your company sounds amazing, Pierre. I'll support you all the way." I think, at that moment, we both started becoming aware of each other. Pierre went on to gain managerial knowledge and skills through his job, and eventually set out on his own. Just before leaving his position at the company, he confessed his feelings to me. "Janet, would you do me the honor of going out with me? Are you sure about me?" That moment remains vivid in my memory even now. Of course, I had no reason to refuse. Our relationship progressed smoothly, and we married a few years later. We were blessed with 2 children, and our life was filled with happiness. The company Pierre founded faced struggles in the beginning, but thanks to his relentless efforts, it began to grow. I continued to work while supporting him, and on weekends, we would spend time planning together and enjoying each other's company. The employees were like a family, united in their determination to create outstanding products. As a result, the company expanded, and Pierre, as president, earned the respect and trust of his staff. It grew into a major corporation, and together, we shared the joy of its success. However, we had one major concern. "Chris isn't back yet." "No, I've warned him so many times." But it was about our eldest son, Chris. As a young boy, he had been well-behaved and serious. But when he entered middle school, his rebellious phase began, and his behavior gradually worsened. Around that time, his younger sister, Rachel, was born. I had hoped that he would get along with her as a big brother, but that wish was never fulfilled. Every day, he would say unkind things to her. "Hey, hurry up now. Chris, don't be mean to Rachel. Shut up, stop nagging me." No matter how many times we scolded him, he wouldn't listen. After entering high school, he began spending most of his time out and about with friends. My husband and I often wondered if we had done something to cause Chris's bad behavior, but we couldn't pinpoint any particular reason. We tried creating opportunities for family conversations, but Chris rarely joined us, and even when we managed to gather, he avoided us altogether. After many struggles with raising him, he finally completed his job search and announced that he wanted to live on his own. Given the circumstances, we were willing to consider his living independently if his workplace was far away, but his job was relatively close to home. When we asked for details about his job, he was vague, only providing basic information about the location. I have something I want to do. That's why I need to live on my own. Chris, living alone isn't easy. You've never done any housework before. I told you I'll be fine. If it doesn't work out, you can come and take me back. We tried to persuade him otherwise, but he wouldn't budge. After discussing the matter with my husband, we concluded that Chris, now employed and an adult, might benefit from gaining experience living on his own. We allowed him to move out. Around this time, Rachel had also been accepted into a prestigious university out of state for her future aspirations, which meant she would also be living alone. This added another layer to our decision. Why does Rachel get to live alone, but not me? That's so unfair. Rachel's university is out of state. That's different. Your workplace is nearby. That doesn't matter. Upset that Rachel was allowed to live alone while he was initially denied, Chris left home in what felt like a near fight. Of course, we provided Rachel with financial support while she was in school, so we reluctantly agreed to send Chris the money as well. We also made sure to check in on his work and living situation, but he always assured us he was fine and everything seemed to be going well. A few years later, we received surprising news from Chris. I'm getting married, he said. What? The announcement came out of the blue, leaving my husband and me in shock. We hadn't heard much about Chris's personal life, so I felt a mix of surprise and happiness. Despite my worries about him, it seemed he had been managing well on his own. I'm coming home soon to introduce her to you. Really? All right, we'll be waiting. It was the first phone call we had received from him in ages. I never imagined he would announce his marriage during that call. In fact, I hadn't even known he was seeing someone. However, how could I not feel happy hearing that my son was getting married? There had certainly been challenging times, and I wasn't always confident in the relationship I had with Chris. I still felt regretful about the way he had left home. But knowing he was managing his life and had found a woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with brought me joy. Pierre, Chris just called. I immediately told my husband. Though surprised at first, he nodded and broke into a warm smile upon hearing the news. After discussing available dates, the meeting with Chris's fiancée, Emily Mirror, was quickly arranged. Finally, the day arrived, and Chris came home with Emily. Nice to meet you. My name is Emily Mirror, and I've been in a relationship with Chris. Nice to meet you. I'm Chris's mother, Janet. Emily greeted me with a smile, wearing a stylish dress, a branded handbag, and some slightly flashy accessories. She seemed like the type of woman Chris would like, I thought, as we exchanged greetings. She was cheerful and lively, and I couldn't help but think she was a lovely person as I welcomed her into the living room. How did you two meet? She is a colleague of mine. We started working together when she joined the company, and before I knew it, I was drawn to her. He made so many efforts to approach me. Before I knew it, I couldn't stop thinking about him either. I see. The two of them fondly recounted how they met and talked about their workplace. But Janet, you and your family seem a bit plain compared to Chris. I saw a photo of Rachel too. Her occasional sharp remarks during the conversation made me feel uneasy. Oh well, even if we do get married, I don't think we'll be interacting much anyway, so it doesn't really matter. She laughed vaguely, and I furrowed my brow. Although the introduction ended quickly, I was left with a lingering sense of distrust toward her. At that time, they had already been dating for several years, and the two soon registered their marriage and held a wedding. However, after the wedding, Emily only attended a few family gatherings and rarely visited our home. Whenever I tried to reach out, she would just say they were busy and didn't make much of an effort to engage with us. I had sensed this would happen since the introduction, so I didn't press the matter. That was a few years ago. Then, another turning point came several years later. My husband fell ill. The disease progressed rapidly, and the once active president of his company quickly became bedridden. At first, he tried to maintain a strong front, but seeing him weaken day by day was undeniably painful for me. However, his company employees and relatives came to visit, even traveling from afar to check on him. Their support helped sustain me emotionally. It reminded me of how wonderful it was to have reliable family members. I'm so sorry. I should still be actively working, but now I'm like this. What are you saying? You've worked so hard, and there's no doubt about that. Your company employees think highly of you and are doing their best every day. You should focus on your treatment. You're right. However, the illness progressed far more rapidly than we had imagined. I'm sorry to say this, but a full recovery is impossible. He has at most 1 year left. That can't be. Though my husband seemed lively in his bed, he was given a grim prognosis. Upon hearing the news, he simply smiled softly and said, "I see." I was devastated, but my husband told me not to worry. That only made my sadness grow. "Dad, how are you feeling?" Our daughter, Rachel, had graduated from college, found a job, and was now married to a wonderful husband. Her husband, Jason, was gentle, kind, and always thoughtful toward us. Even though they lived some distance away, they visited us weekly to check on my husband. Not only did they care for him, but they also worried about me, which left me deeply grateful. I felt proud to have raised such a wonderful daughter. "I'm doing fine. You don't need to come every week. You know, Jason must have work to do. Please don't worry about that. Pierre has done so much for me, especially during the wedding. I see this as a chance to give back. The fact that Rachel married someone as wonderful as you is already more than enough." My husband eagerly looked forward to their weekly visits, though he told them not to bother. It was clear that their presence gave him strength. While I was grateful, I couldn't help but harbor a lingering dissatisfaction. It was, of course, about our eldest son and his wife. I had informed them of my husband's illness and his prognosis. Unlike Rachel and Jason, who lived farther away, Chris and Emily lived near us. And yet, they had not visited even once to see him. This weighed heavily on my heart. I had sent several emails about it, only to be told, "We're too busy. Your father is sick. Surely, you can spare a little time to visit him." That unfulfilled wish faded into silence. Time passed, and Chris and Emily still didn't visit. As time went on, my husband grew weaker. Then one day, Chris and Emily finally came to visit. "Dad, how are you feeling?" "Chris, couldn't you have come earlier?" "Come on, we were busy." With no hint of remorse, Chris and Emily smiled vaguely. But from that point on, they started visiting more frequently, even when I was managing my husband's company and couldn't be at the hospital. Chris and Emily were apparently spending time there. "Mom, Chris is asking Dad for money." "What? What do you mean?" I learned the true reason behind Chris and Emily's recent visits through Rachel. Apparently, she had run into them at the hospital and witnessed Chris asking my husband for money. When I confronted my husband about it, he admitted to knowing but had deliberately kept it from me. He hadn't mentioned anything to me before, and hearing about it now left me both shocked and confused. Dad made me promise not to. I did ask Chris about it, but he just said, "Dad's okay with it." When I asked Dad if you knew, he said he had his reasons and asked me to keep quiet. I see. I know Dad always has his reasons, but he has a habit of handling everything on his own. He's strict sometimes, but he cares so much about the family. I wish he'd let himself feel cared for too. Rachel sighed and gave a small smile. And Chris, he's unbelievable. He barely visited when Dad was hospitalized, but as soon as he got a terminal prognosis, he starts showing up. Emily too, they're only here because they're trying to get money. It's disgraceful. He hadn't changed a bit. Rachel's tone was bitter, her expression dark. Chris had always been tough on Rachel, which probably added to her frustration. In truth, he had rarely acted like an older brother to her. I nodded slightly and spoke. Thank you for telling me, Rachel. I'll talk to your father about this. Leave it to us. Okay. But if you need any help, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you, Rachel. That evening, I spoke with my husband. I asked him directly if it was true that Chris had been asking him for money. He smiled and shrugged lightly. Guess I've been found out. Rachel's too kind for her own good. Looking out the window, he seemed distant, as if lost in thought. Then he turned to me and said, Janet, I need to ask something of you. His words startled me, but I quickly nodded, determined to listen. In that moment, I realized that this was no longer just a matter of family ties. Though it pained me, I knew we couldn't continue enabling Chris. A few months later, my husband passed away. He spent his final days surrounded by family and colleagues, in peace. We held the funeral and took care of all the arrangements. Chris and Emily didn't participate in the preparations or contribute financially. To make matters worse, they didn't even show up in my husband's final moments. By that point, my mind was made up. I decided to wait for what I knew was coming, a proposal from Chris and Emily. And as expected, just a few days later, they came to me with a certain suggestion. Mom, why don't you come live with us? What? I tilted my head in confusion, and Chris continued with a smile. We've realized how much freedom we've had because of how you raised us. So now it's our turn to support you. You must be struggling with Dad gone, right? His words made anger bubble inside me, but I managed to suppress it. These were the same people who hadn't contributed a cent to the funeral, and whose first concern after my husband's death was the inheritance. It was obvious their true interest lay in the house and assets I currently owned, exactly as my husband had predicted. Chris, Janet, if you don't mind, I'd really love for us to live together. I want to build a stronger relationship with you. Emily's insincere words almost made me shout, but I kept my composure and agreed to their suggestion. And so we began living together. Months passed. Almost immediately after moving in, Chris and Emily started living a lazy, self-indulgent life. I handled most of the household chores, and any time I asked for help, they came up with excuses. Though I grew increasingly frustrated during that short time, I maintained my composure, honoring the promise I made to my husband. I waited patiently for Chris and Emily to act, just as my husband had predicted. Finally, the moment arrived. Mom, this is sudden, but we're going on a trip next week. A trip, yay, with the money Dad left us before he passed. We've already planned everything. We'll be gone for a while, so take care of the house, okay? It was exactly as my husband had said. I almost laughed at how absurd it was. Money Pierre left behind. There was no such fund. Chris and Emily had simply latched onto a convenient fiction. We'll bring you back some souvenirs, so don't worry. And this money, what exactly is it? It's a secret, Mom. Anyway, see you later. The next week, Chris and Emily left for their trip. While they were away, I got to work on something I'd been planning for a long time. Finally, I would sever this toxic cycle once and for all. Knowing that made my hands move faster as I completed the task. A week later, the two of them returned home, visibly exhausted from their trip. Ignoring their fatigue, I confronted them without hesitation. Chris, you used my card for that trip, didn't you? My platinum card. The two froze momentarily at my sudden words, but quickly broke into loud laughter. Yeah, so what? I'm your son, so there's no problem with me using it, right? This card was something Pierre left for me. Using it without my permission is completely unacceptable. Hearing this, Chris and Emily exchanged sly smiles before speaking. Mom, you don't need that much money, do you? We're putting it to better use. Exactly. And Pierre would be happier knowing we're living fulfilling lives thanks to it. Their brazen remarks made me want to sigh deeply. Chris hadn't changed at all. No matter how much I tried to talk sense into him or convey his father's kindness, it never got through. My husband's predictions had come true, and the realization pained me. He probably never wanted to think it would come to this. Look at the name on the card, I said calmly. What? Chris squinted at the card. Huh? It's just your name, Mom. He looked at me with an expression that seemed to ask, what are you talking about? Emily mirrored his confusion. I sighed and spoke again. Yes, it does have my name on it. But that's Pierre's company's corporate card. What? As my words sank in, Chris's eyes widened in shock. He looked back at the card, and then paled instantly. Corporate cards are issued to business owners, including sole proprietors. They often have higher credit limits and features that make them suitable for business use, like issuing cards to employees. Before my husband passed, he entrusted this card to me. I had already been using it for managing the company's affairs, so it was natural for me to have it. But on that day, my husband made a particular request. A request? What do you mean? As you know, since I fell ill, Chris has been asking for financial support. I'm still the president and have a fair amount of assets. Of course, I've also carefully considered how the estate will be divided. He lowered his gaze briefly and continued speaking slowly. Here's the thing, Chris and Emily both work for a company that happens to be one of my business partners. What? The revelation left me wide-eyed, and I couldn't help but raise my voice in shock. Seeing my reaction, my husband let out a right chuckle before continuing. Apparently, it was common knowledge that Chris and Emily had started dating at work. When my husband realized they shared the same surname, he discovered that Chris worked there. Chris hadn't informed us of his employer when he got the job, so even my husband had been surprised to learn about it. After that, he discreetly gathered information about Chris's behavior from trusted people at the partner company. It turned out that when Chris learned of his father's illness, his immediate reaction had been to boast about inheriting a fortune once his wealthy father passed away. In other words, even while his father was gravely ill, Chris's first concern had been about claiming his inheritance. Chris did that. As a parent, I don't want to believe it, but I can't ignore it either. We've always wanted Chris to be happy, but he doesn't value family the same way. That realization was a huge shock to me. I'm sorry to burden you with this, Janet, but I think it's time to seriously consider the inheritance. I couldn't begin to fathom the pain my husband must have felt, having to deal with such matters on his deathbed. Seeing my stunned reaction, he smiled and revealed something to me. You remember the corporate card I entrusted to you? The one for managing our company's expenses. That card is tied to the company's assets. I might have let slip its existence to Chris. My guess is that after I'm gone, the two of them will try to get their hands on it. Keep the card in the second drawer of the living room cabinet, where they can find it easily. You're saying they might take it and use it without permission. I never gave them explicit permission. I just mentioned it was there. Of course, if they do use it, that would constitute embezzling company funds. And as you know, corporate cards aren't meant for personal use. But unless they face a serious consequence, Chris won't learn. I've even heard from trusted people at his workplace that he's been harassing other employees and covering up his mistakes. That's awful. You and Rachel don't need to worry about the inheritance. I've already arranged everything with our lawyer to ensure it's handled properly. The rest has been taken care of to secure your future. Listening to his words, I finally began to come to terms with the reality of my husband's illness. Until then, a part of me had resisted accepting it, but knowing that even in his condition, he had planned everything to protect our family, I knew I had to honor his wishes. Understood, I replied firmly. A crime is still a crime, even if committed by family. Adults who knowingly break the law must be held accountable. Carrying out my husband's final wishes, I now stood face to face with Chris and Emily, explaining the situation step by step. Their faces turned paler with every word. What do you mean? You've got to be kidding. That card was issued by your father's company. Using it without permission means you've embezzled company funds. That's theft, Chris. I could report you to the police for it. Wait, what? Chris froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. Emily, standing beside him, was equally stunned. Look, we didn't know. How were we supposed to know? Didn't know. Regardless, using someone else's credit card without their permission is a crime. There's no excuse for that. You spent an entire week enjoying yourselves on what you thought was my money. I imagine you racked up quite the bill. So here's the deal, pay it back immediately, or I'll report you to the police. Your choice. Wait, how could you do this to family? At Emily's words, something inside me snapped. Family. They had the audacity to call this family after stealing from us. And now they wanted to hide behind that word when it suited them. That hypocrisy was more infuriating than anything else. Family, you say? When your father-in-law was sick and given only a short time to live, you didn't even bother to show up or get involved in the funeral, leaving everything on us. And now, after all of that, you have the nerve to propose living together. If you were family, wouldn't you visit your ailing family member at least once when they're about to pass? Emily clenched her lips, likely unable to respond because the truth hit too close to home. As I watched her in silence, Chris, now visibly flustered, began speaking. No, wait. It was just a little money I borrowed from family. Right, Dad had plenty of assets. So what's the big deal? We needed a break too. Chris, Pierre was trying to ensure that you and Emily would inherit properly, even up until the end. But then you went around boasting that if Dad passed, you'd inherit a large sum from his company. How do you know about that? It seemed Chris hadn't realized that the company he worked for was a client of my husband's. I sighed before continuing. It turns out that the company he was dealing with was your employer's. And because you two were blabbing about such things to everyone, word got to Pierre. Imagine how betrayed he must have felt, trying to trust his own son until the very end. I didn't know. There were no more excuses to offer. I looked at them both directly and, staring them down, I spoke firmly. I won't be living together with you. Now that I know the truth, I'm cutting ties with you as family. Also, regarding the matter of the credit card, I've already consulted a lawyer. I suggest you pack up and leave by the end of the week. The two of them turned pale, visibly panicked. They approached me, seemingly desperate. Wait, please don't do that. We'll pay you back. Think about how this will affect our jobs if this gets out. I don't care about that. You knew exactly what you were doing when you used a card, didn't you? You took a risk from the start. Anyone, even a child, would know that using someone else's credit card without permission is wrong. Seeing them speechless, I could tell they had no remorse. Their words were all self-serving, and it was clear they were only concerned with their own skin. I'd had enough of their hollow apologies. I told Emily, who had started crying, and Chris, who hung his head in defeat, that they had to leave within the week. They tried to argue, but once they realized I wouldn't budge, they snapped, grumbling as they left. Afterward, I informed the relevant relatives. The relatives, who had known that Chris and Emily hadn't been involved in the funeral, understood the situation and promised to refuse any help if they came asking. "Mom, are you okay?" "Yes, I'm fine. I'm sorry for worrying you." "No need to apologize." After that, Chris contacted me, but when I responded with the truth, he just got angry. He really doesn't seem to have any remorse, does he? Later, I received an update from Rachel, and I shared the recent developments with her. Thanks to the lawyer my husband had arranged, the amount used by Chris was going to be returned along with compensation. Even though they were family, there's a line between what's acceptable and what's not. They kept trying to push their way, but I wasn't about to back down. Now I imagine they're struggling to pay back all the money they spent. In the end, it seems they reached out to various relatives asking for help, but no one offered any. It's a tough situation for them, but it's entirely their own doing. I learned from someone at my husband's client company about Chris's actions. After all, it was revealed that he had used company funds for personal purchases and engaged in harassment toward employees, leading to his demotion. However, both he and Emily, with their high pride, couldn't tolerate the gossip and decided to resign voluntarily. The industry he worked in is specialized, but my husband's company had extensive connections, and word of what happened spread widely, making it difficult for him to find another job in the same field. They continued to contact me regularly, but following Rachel's advice, I blocked their calls. I never imagined I would sever ties with family, but the reality of what had happened with my own child left me with a pang of regret. Finally, everything seemed to be over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing deep inside. It's fine being alone in the house my husband left me, but I couldn't deny that this situation had left a significant emotional toll on me, and I sighed deeply. A few days later, I received a phone call. "Mom, are you okay?" "Yes, I'm fine. What's wrong?" Ever since then, my daughter and her husband had been reaching out more often. On this day, Rachel made a suggestion. "Well, there's been a transfer at Jason's company, and it just happens to be near your house." "What? Really?" "Yeah, so if you're okay with it, Mom, would you want to live with us?" Her proposal caught me off guard. Of course, I was overjoyed. The fact that my daughter and her husband, who had been so considerate of us, were moving closer was already such wonderful news. "I'm happy, but I don't want to intrude on your time together. I'm glad you're moving nearby, though. Jason talked it over with me, and he's really hoping we can live with you. After everything that happened, and with Dad gone, I think having someone around for a while will help distract you. But living together could create more discomfort than I imagined." I couldn't help but think that gentle Jason might feel awkward about it, trying to be considerate of me. As I hesitated, I heard Jason's voice on the other end of the line. "Hi, Janet." "Hi, Jason. Thank you again for everything the other day." "No, it's no problem, actually. I'd really like to live with you too, Janet. If you're concerned about me, please don't worry. I'm just really grateful to both of you." Jason's words made my heart warm, and I realized I had tears in my eyes. When a sob escaped me, I heard panicked voices from the other end of the phone. "Wait, are you crying, Mom?" I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Seeing how frantic they both were made me laugh despite myself. Just having people around who cared for me like this was so healing. And I truly felt that from the bottom of my heart. Are you sure? I'm not bothering you. Of course not. I want to live with you, Mom. I do too. Thank you. Well, I guess I'll say yes. Work, marriage, parenting. There have been many challenges. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. And perhaps there were mistakes in how we raised Chris. But now, with my husband, my well-raised daughter, and my new family who cares about me, along with the employees who supported my husband, I realize I'm standing here today because of all the people who have been there for me. Going forward, I will cherish those around me and live to the fullest, hoping to give back in return.